So far, we have seen multiple examples of how the Great Convergence led to contacts between people and transformed their cultures. When we talk about European expansion in terms of trade, conquest, and religion, we can begin to imagine that this was a one-way flow of culture. But it wasn't that simple. Europeans and their cultures were transformed by the Great Convergence and its consequences. We've already seen this with the new knowledge developed in the European scientific revolution and related processes. Now, in some cases, European colonizers and people back in Europe embraced foreign or exotic influences from the societies they had contact with. One instance that allows us to see how empire and culture combined to have a significant social impact on a European society is the desire for chocolate in Spanish America, Spain, and then in the rest of Europe and the United States. Chocolate appeared very strange to the Spanish when they first encountered it in the Americas. The cultural context for its consumption were equally strange and contrary to the Catholic Christian religious culture embraced by the Spanish. So why did chocolate become so popular in the Spanish Empire and then later in other parts of Europe? Chocolate is especially interesting because it was the first of the luxury groceries that Europeans accepted into their daily lives, even before they became addicted to the wonderfulness of coffee. Over the long term, these foreign consumables, which included chocolate, tobacco, coffee, tea, and sugar, went from exotic products for the elite to things that ordinary people used every day, or at least as often as they could afford to consume them. In fact, it may be the case that the desire among ordinary working people for these items stimulated the growth of European economies and industrialization, because ordinary people had to work to get money to buy these things that they increasingly craved. Now, since none of these items grew in Europe, which meant that ordinary people could not grow them for themselves, they had to be imported and purchased. For most people, the only means to get the money they needed to pay taxes and buy imported goods was to work for others. So this meant working in the factories and other industries related to the growing global economy. So working people got a little cash in their pockets to buy smokes and joe and other goodies, and factory bosses got the labor they needed to run their businesses and get rich from both the productivity and consumption behaviors of working people. Additionally, consuming these imports usually required other things, additives, or what we might call accessories these days, that created other flows of goods, money, and labor. But let's get back to the history of chocolate in setting off this process. We typically remember the Spanish presence in Mesoamerica through the lens of conquest and forget the society created by indigenous people and the European and African newcomers after the conquest. Chocolate was a fundamental part of daily life in Mesoamerica before and after the conquest, and this continuity is essential to its inclusion in Spanish culture and then in other European cultures. Mesoamerica had many diverse peoples and states at the time of first contact with the Spanish in the early 1500s, and the consumption of chocolate was shared across geographical and linguistic differences in Mesoamerica. Now, the method for making real chocolate has been more or less the same for centuries. The traditional way of consuming chocolate is not to eat it like we usually do now, but to drink it as a hot, frothy beverage. This was how people in Mesoamerica had been consuming for countless generations by the time the Spanish first arrived. They also flavored it with maize, or corn, chili peppers, vanilla, honey, and other fragrant plants. According to a Spanish source, quote, "When an ordinary amount is drunk, it gladdens one, refreshes one, consoles one, invigorates one," unquote. This video shows how chocolate has been made in Mesoamerica. There are some modern aspects to the process seen here, but its core elements are very much like what people were doing in the era when the Spanish arrived.
I decided to pay a visit to some friends in the village of Teotitlán del Valle. The Ruiz family operates a terrific taqueria in this small village outside of Oaxaca. Mrs. Ruiz also happens to be an expert at preparing cacao for drinking chocolate. She was more than happy to show me how it's done. We were welcome into the backyard where the comal was already heating over a wood fire. She slowly moved the cacao around the hot griddle with a dried corn husk, roasting the beans to an intensely aromatic doneness. Like coffee beans, cacao can be roasted to varying degrees of darkness to achieve a desired flavor. My olfactory senses were transfixed on the fragrance of the roasted cacao mixed with wood smoke. With her older daughter, the three of us crouched around the pot of roasted beans, peeling the bitter membranes to prepare them for grinding. So you have this little membrane, just like a peanut, and you crunch it a little bit, just to get the shell cracked.
Cuando hay fiesta, alguna fiesta en una casa, mucho.
Sí.
Mucho, una tina.
Pero espero que hay más personas que están ayudando. No solo. After smelling that intense fragrance for the past hour, I quickly popped a few of the morsels in my mouth to experience the flavor of the unadulterated bean. A heightened sensation quickly took hold in my brain. We then moved into the kitchen to further the process on a metate. If I could get one of these basalt stone tables in my carry-on luggage, I'd bring it back to the States with me. They're super effective for grinding ingredients. Unfortunately, they're also very heavy. I watched as she quickly pulverized the roasted beans into a fine powder. The smell of chocolate was now everywhere as she continued to add more beans to the grinding surface. Like a child with their face pressed up against the glass window of a candy store, I moved in as close as possible to observe. This simple tool fascinates me as it holds an artful place in Mexican food preparation. Whenever I get the chance, I try to practice my grinding skills, with some modest success. ¿Se muda o no? Solamente lo así.
Sí.
But I'll never be as good as her, because she feels the way in every fiber of her being. To be that comfortable in the preparation of one's native cuisine is truly a gift, like speaking a language fluently. She showed me effortlessly the culmination of her many years of experience grinding ingredients for the family meals. As she continued the process, she added sugar and spices to form a thick paste. This would be mixed with hot water, which comes from the pre-Columbian tradition of making drinking chocolate. She places a large cube of the cacao paste in the pitcher of water and stirs vigorously with a molinillo, a wooden whisk designed to add foam to drinking chocolate, and finally produces a delicious cup of euphoria to soothe my anxious palate. I will always acquaint the smell of chocolate with certain experiences now, and the impassioned faces of the people who care about it.
Chocolate had spiritual qualities too, which made it especially important in Mesoamerican cultures. Chocolate was most esteemed when it had a reddish color, and this gave it an association with blood. So people used it to treat bleeding, to bless marriages, and to sacrifice something to gods as a proxy for the blood that they required. In this image, we see Maya gods letting blood from their ears onto cacao pods, thus imbuing them with their life force to grow. Additionally, we see the centrality of chocolate consumption in a ritual that celebrated the connection between people and the gods. Mexica warriors gathered at night during a ceremonial sequence at a site where they danced, sang, and drank chocolate and ate certain mushrooms. This eventually led them to a state in which they had visions about their futures. After they shared the information from their visions with each other, they danced and sang more while drinking even more chocolate as they made offerings to the gods. They continued at this all night. We see in this illustration of a ritual similar to the one I just described the centrality of the warriors in the courtyard where the others made chocolate nearby. This was the male part of the rite. The next day was the female part, and there was no chocolate, only maize. The connection between chocolate, which was symbolic of male spiritual power, and maize, which was symbolic of female spiritual power, appeared fundamental to the ritual, and it represented one of the most common combinations in the preparation of chocolate for everyday consumption. The connection came up again in portrayals of marriage. Chocolate symbolized the mixing of blood, and the most important symbol of marriage was a container filled with frothy chocolate. Another common belief was that people could put substances in chocolate to enchant in various ways those who drank it. This could be used in any kind of sorcery, and there were many accusations that people used chocolate to bewitch others. After Spanish conquest, Catholic Christian priests had a mixed response to the use of chocolate in Christian contexts. Because wine was scarce in New Spain, chocolate was used in Mass to celebrate the Eucharist. This made a lot of sense because the chocolate was perceived as blood in Mesoamerican spiritual cultures, as was wine in European Christianity. But some priests did not approve, as they knew that chocolate was used as an offering to Mesoamerican gods, so they could not be sure what religion was being served when chocolate appeared in Christian rituals. Further, Mesoamericans gave chocolate offerings to their ancestors on the Christian holiday of All Souls' Day, providing another point of cultural convergence that satisfied the religious needs of indigenous people, but vexed Christian priests in their efforts to spread a version of Christianity devoid of the contamination of so-called heathen idolatry. These complicated connections with the spiritual symbolism of chocolate did not fade for a very long time, and they came up frequently in the Americas and even in Spain once the beverage became popular there. Cacao was one of the major tribute items that the subject of the Aztecs had to offer, and when the Spanish conquered the Aztec state, they not only continued this requirement but also demanded even more production. Cacao was used as a form of currency and proved to be a lucrative trade item throughout Mesoamerica, so the Spanish could generate wealth from it even before they started exporting it across the Atlantic to Europe. Further, it seems inevitable that chocolate would be introduced to Spanish colonial society because colonizers from Spain formed only 5% of the population of the capital of New Spain in 1570 and only 10% of the city's population by the mid-1600s. The Spanish may have been conquerors, but they were enveloped in Mesoamerica, and the culture of New Spain reflected this reality. As Spanish men and indigenous women created relationships of various kinds, women introduced the men to the daily consumption of chocolate. Also, the common practice of offering chocolate as a standard form of hospitality continued when Spanish priests and representatives of the state visited villages. Now, because indigenous women often served as the domestic servants of the Spanish, they controlled the preparation of food, which invariably included local cuisine, including chocolate. And the numerous markets of Mesoamerica always included chocolate vendors. Many among the first Europeans to encounter chocolate had very negative appraisals of it. One stated that chocolate, quote, seemed more like a drink for pigs than a drink for humanity, unquote. Another thought that the foam on the drink was like feces. While some Europeans had these attitudes, obviously many others drank it and liked it enough to spread it back to Spain. People of Spanish descent from the Americas who traveled to Spain brought chocolate with them and prepared it in the same ways that it was prepared in the Americas, including adding maize and honey and other spices, and in creating a froth by pouring the liquid with the appropriate containers. At this point, the material form of chocolate consumption by Indians, Criollos, or the Creoles, and Spanish colonizers had not changed in over a century after first contact, and this was eventually taken to Spain where it caught on in the 1600s. Now, once chocolate became a familiar presence in Spain, people there began to modify its preparation. Most significantly, they began to add sugar to sweeten it. Additionally, they substituted spices from Asia for the American spices that the traditional preparation of chocolate required. The Spanish used cinnamon, black pepper, and other Old World spices, although it seems that many Spanish chocolate connoisseurs still favored the American ingredients. The American spices, however, were much less accessible, so this accounts for the shift to the Old World spices. These changes in flavoring chocolate were portrayed as early as the 1700s as Spanish improvements on a savage product and cultural item, but the reality was that the Spanish were trying to use readily available ingredients to replicate the original indigenous American forms that were harder to recreate in Spain. Why did the story get distorted? Because the Spanish were the conquerors. They brought civilization to the Indians, and they were the agents of cultural change. The reality, however, was more complicated. The Spanish indeed conquered and colonized Mesoamerica, but they were changed by the indigenous people and cultures they lived with after the conquest. In turn, people and culture in Spain were transformed by the cultural innovation that started in the Americas. This was a recurring process in the aftermath of the Great Convergence. Europe did not simply go out into the world, but the world came to Europe as well. We most definitely see the continuity in the culture of chocolate consumption in Spain. Now, this was limited to the elite, as they were the only ones who could afford the chocolate in the serving vessels that they used in their chocolate parties. The changes that the elite in Spain introduced came primarily in the things they used to prepare and serve chocolate. We will see this process in two images. The first image is a still life painting by Antonio Ponce. A gourd used to drink the chocolate, called a jícara, and the device used to make the chocolate frothy, called a molinillo, were employed in Spain, and people there called them by their Nahuatl labels as well. Soon, however, people started to take their chocolate in other kinds of cups that reflected the diverse range of vessels produced in Spain and imported from the Americas and Asia. The second image, a still life by Antonio de Pereda, includes this range. First, look toward the bottom left of the painting. Tucked in there is the molinillo, the frothing stick, and 3 drinking cups. The 2 in the front were likely made in Spain of ceramic, and the one in back was likely porcelain imported from Asia. On top of the chest is the familiar gourd from the Americas, as well as a red ceramic cup, also from New Spain. All of these drinking vessels, except for the red cup, were called jícaras in Spain, no matter what they were made of or where they were made. So even as chocolate became intertwined with European ideas about cultural sophistication and luxury, the elite retained the use of distinctly Mesoamerican utensils and words when partaking of chocolate in their revelries. While the material culture surrounding chocolate showed both continuity and change, the spiritual cultural meanings of chocolate underwent a radical shift. How did the Spanish strip chocolate of its Mesoamerican religious meanings? They turned it into medicine. Those who were proponents of chocolate but who rejected its religious purposes asserted its medicinal properties, thus making it an indispensable, legitimate substance, a status that could, it was hoped, overcome the sacred and magical characteristics given to it by Mesoamericans and the European and African newcomers in the Americas. Well, it seems to have worked because in our society we credit chocolate with being an aphrodisiac, but we don't connect it to any ideas about sacred fertility. One is just a physiological reaction, while the other is a religious worldview. Back in those days, however, some did not agree. They disputed the medicinal qualities attributed to chocolate and saw in it the insidiousness of Mesoamerican culture and so-called sorcery in corrupting Spanish culture and religion. Further, the desire for chocolate, which could have been an expression of actual addiction, came to be seen as an attachment to worldly pleasure that distracted people from true Christian devotion. Others followed this line of criticism but directed it at the Catholic Church, as priests were often dedicated drinkers of chocolate. These critiques argued that the Church was hypocritical for persecuting so-called heretics when its own representatives seemed more concerned with getting their chocolate fix than with the proper display of piety. So we find here a rich dialogue about chocolate, religion, authority, and pleasure that goes far beyond merely consuming an exotic drink. As this dialogue played out in Europe with its ongoing political and social changes, it divested chocolate of its association with Mesoamerican culture and domesticated it as an internal European thing. This leads us back to the significance of chocolate in the big picture. Chocolate spread from Spain to other parts of Europe in the 1600s as a preoccupation of the elite class. It served an essential role in preparing Europe for the acceptance of 2 other dark foreign beverages, coffee and tea, that would have an even bigger role in the global economy and political reorganization of the world. In the 19th century, the making of chocolate was transformed by industrialization. Newly developed processes allowed for different uses of cacao, and new technologies permitted the mass production of packaged chocolate pieces made with lots of sugar in the solid form familiar to us today. By the early 20th century, inexpensive, mass-produced chocolate became one of the treats and stimulants that working people created and then spent their hard-earned money on as they became more entrenched in both the production and consumption aspects of the industrializing global economy. It was during this period, from the early 19th century through the early 20th century, that chocolate became an industrial enterprise with factories and factory towns mirroring the other sectors of industrialization that transformed the economies and societies of Europe, the US, and Japan. A big difference, however, was that the most prominent chocolate makers in England were run by people who experimented with new approaches to corporate organization and better treatment of workers that were intended to create a morally, socially, and economically sustainable industry. They had seen the depredations of industrialization in earlier decades and the dangers it posed for political and social stability. They also belonged to a Christian sect, the Quakers, that embraced certain values that they argued should guide the ways that people in the industrialized world should conduct business. Whether or not these approaches completely succeeded in the long run is debatable, but the fact is that chocolate production and consumption has flourished since then. Further, despite the interventions of enlightened capitalists such as the Quaker chocolate industrialists, chocolate was part of a global economy that did not operate according to the policies, moral or not, of individual entrepreneurs. Just as chocolate drinking expanded from Spain, so too did the demand for the cacao used to make chocolate. As chocolate consumption caught on in France, England, and the Netherlands during the 1600s, planters in the American colonies of these states employed enslaved people to produce the cacao. This did not reach the levels of sugar or coffee production during the days of slavery, but the technological advances that allowed for the creation and mass production of tasty solid chocolate in the 1800s spurred the spread of cacao planting to West Africa, where the British and French extended their imperial reach in the same century. There may have been locally devised varieties of cacao in West Africa before, but the cacao that was planted and exported from West Africa following the 1870s was introduced by European colonizers for pure resource extraction for the big business of chocolate manufacture and consumption in Europe and the United States. Many of the Africans employed in cacao farming were supposedly free wage laborers, but the reality was that they had little or no choice in their personal movement and they could not control their own labor under colonial laws. Many were called indentured servants, but for all intents and purposes, they were captives of a larger political and economic structure. This topic gets deep into the Second Imperial Era, which is something that we will address further in the next theme. In the end, we must remember that we cannot understand industrialization just by looking at the industrialized societies alone. Industrialization required massive amounts of raw resources, and those resources had to come from somewhere and be produced by someone. Between the late 1700s and early 1900s, when industrialization first emerged in Europe and then extended into a global presence, the places and people that provided the raw materials for the manufacturers and markets of consumers were tropical lands worked by enslaved, colonized, and otherwise exploited people. In the big picture, then, our introduction to the history of chocolate tells us that this substance is more than a little treat. It is a thing that comes to us loaded with the stories of Mesoamerican gods, sacred blood, conquest, imperialism, slavery, pleasure, and agony. It tastes of the bittersweet history of our world over the last few centuries.